Hello everyone, welcome back to the TJOmega channel for day 1141 of our daily content grind. Today we are looking at, well, a topic from over a decade ago that some of you, if you've joined up with the fandom in that time period, you might not even be aware that something like this happened, except for maybe when someone complains about the price of things these days. That tends to be where it came up. Well, unfortunately, due to recent news with Hasbro, the relevancy has gone up significantly. So it's a history lesson today to kind of remind you of something that happened back in around 2011, 2012, technically, that we need to address because it might happen again. And that is worrying. So, what you're seeing on screen is a report that Hasbro has been revealing their changes that they have designed in order to cut speed to market time and allow design to value from the start. Now, this is to say they're trying to redo things so that they can get toys out faster and so that they can actually get toys cheaper. Now, we kind of know that the toys are way overpriced these days. You know, like, I genuinely don't believe that Springer that they just put out really does justify a $55 price point. It's a Voyager with some static extra parts attached. I could say the same thing about a lot of the figures these days. I don't believe that. Bumblebee. I love that Studio Series Bumblebee. The 86 one. It ain't worth 25 bucks. That is not a $25 toy compared to everything else, and nothing you can say convinces me of that. So, when they start to say, oh, well, we're going to make sure toys are going to be more affordable or cheaper at the retail, that is basically them admitting we're going to make them cheaper again. Now, they do this gradually in small ways over the years. But the first time we really experienced it was about 14 years ago. So let's go all the way back to 2010 for a second. This was a great period in Transformers. So you had like the tail ends of Revenge of the Fallen, if you liked your really complex, intricate Transformers. We had Animated. Animated was a thing around this time. If you really liked you're like me, you like your sleeker, more intuitive, like Animated was wrapping up around the same time. And then things like Reveal the Shield started happening, and we started getting toys like this Jazz, where it felt like a proper return to the really solid and like nice toys of Transformers classics. I still don't think anything really beats this version of Jazz. He's had a few toys since this one came out. I don't think they are necessarily better than this one. This one is very fully featured and very good. And that seemed to continue. In 2011, we got some really banger figures as well. I think that's when we got the Lug Nut, like the Hunt for the Decepticons Lug Nut that everyone loves. This Warpath, for instance, which is one of my favorite deluxes of all time. I love this figure. But when we look through all the different toys that were starting to come out, it really does show just how good things were at the time. Transformers Prime First Edition put out some brilliant toys, not only very solid, very show accurate, but very well designed. Very well designed. And in 2011, I'll even give credit to the Dark of the Moon toys. I have often said on this channel, I think Dark of the Moon was the best of the live action lines, especially if you go to the originals, because they still looked really close to how they did in the movie, but the designs and the engineering were so much cleaner and more intuitive. They did not rely nearly as much on a lot of fiddly tabs and panels to make their transformations work. This was just a line full of dead solid toys. But if you read between the lines and really saw what they were doing with Dark of the Moon, you could see the writing on the wall. A big aspect of that toy line, and why I credit them with being as good as they were, was the fact that all of the gimmick had been removed from the action figure itself and put into a very large, unwieldy gimmick weapon. On Sideswipe here, it's this gigantic rifle with a big flip out blade. It was just fine. You know, I like the fact that the gimmicks were separate because it let the action figures be action figures without the worry of things like automorph breaking on you if you do the toy in the wrong order or anything like that. But the result was the characters themselves and the toys themselves were noticeably a little bit smaller, but because they came with such a big accessory, we could still see where the money was going. Looking back on it now, we realize that was Hasbro training us for how small Transformers were about to become. This is when we get into 2012 and the big budget crunch. We have had to go to Sabertron.com for a few comparison shots, so I will thank them for providing the photos, because they're the only ones who really have good demonstrations of what happened. Here is War for Cybertron Optimus Prime next to his 2012 counterpart, Fall of Cybertron Optimus Prime. And the difference is staggering. These toys are only a few years apart, but you can see just from one comparison shot, the intricacy is not even remotely close. He is scrawnier, he is smaller, and keep in mind, it's supposed to be the same character. But everything got dramatically reduced. He is incredibly small for how the design is. And honestly, extremely simple by comparison. You know, like that Optimus on the left, that's actually a pretty intricate figure. You know, especially for a deluxe. Whereas the one on the right, I would almost equate the level of engineering on that to a warrior class toy today. It's really very simple as far as a transformation goes. To the point where it is to its detriment and where it really is, you know, kind of boring. I'd say the same thing happened in the Prime line. We went from these really beautiful first edition figures down to the Prime RID toys, which got gimmick loaded as well as just dramatically more simple. It's disappointing. It was really disappointing. It felt like overnight everything that Transformers was putting out was suddenly smaller, lower quality, and it was frustrating to be a collector at the time because we didn't really have a choice. We just had to grin and accept it, which sucked. So, why did it happen? Now, here's the thing. This wasn't a cost-cutting thing. This was not a Hasbro greed thing. You know, we really like to blame Hasbro as collectors for what goes wrong. For some reason, there is this whole group of collectors out there with a mindset that Hasbro is trying to intentionally tank their own product, which is never the case, by the way. But when we look at this, yes, there is a reason. In 2011 and 2012, we were going through an oil crisis. And the price of everything that took petroleum, toys included, went through the roof. This is pretty much what happens anytime. This is a big factor to why Transformers suddenly go down in size or suddenly go up in price, one or the other. It sucks, but that's the economy. Economy sucks. But, you know, you don't really have a choice in the matter here. So I'm not going to blame Hasbro outright for it. However, it is still a reason for why the budgeting actually went down considerably for Transformers all at once, just like it's threatening to do in the near future. And it's something that lasted for years. It was years. So, whenever there was a brand new series of Transformer toys, the earliest waves always seemed to suffer the most from Hasbro and Takara's engineers trying to figure out how to work with the current year's budget, how to work with the new designs and the new gimmicks or whatever they were working with. So there was always growing pains, but then they got over it. But this was years worth of growing pains in order to get these toys to be functional. A year later, the toys still hadn't regained their size. You know, and I like that Orion Pax. I think that is a good toy. And while the complexity is up from the previous comparison to this Optimus Prime, it does still just hurt the character overall. And it's a good toy. It's just not nearly what it should have been or could have been, which is unfortunate. This is also a time when Hasbro tried to do a few interesting things. For instance, that's when they decided to do a new combiner. And I think pretty much everybody would agree that that Bruticus, while it does open the door for all the combiners we've had since then and prove that, yes, collectors are interested in this, you can sell these, oh boy, they are rough. They are very rough toys. This is like where you can really see the budget really getting damaged here. Because these really should have been way more robust. These should have been way more detailed, and Onslaught should have been way bigger. But we got what we got, which is unfortunate, but yeah. So we had a lot of toys suffering from this. And it's a real shame that this was the ambitious time for Hasbro, because, you know, they had to be ambitious with like 30% less of figure to work with. This happened with Prime as well. And I feel bad for Prime, because the start of it, the original plan for Prime, was to sprinkle its figures in with the Generations line. What we saw in first edition was supposed to be, you know, just like the first wave of them, and then, you know, gradually getting more as the cartoon went on, and eventually just mixed in with the Generations line, we would eventually get the whole cast here. Because Prime didn't have that big of a cast, so they could have gotten away with that. Budget crunch happens. So instead, they scrapped the idea of the larger deluxes that they had been doing, and instead, everything needs to get redesigned from the ground up, and that's how we get the Prime RID line, which became a primary line instead, I assume to make up the development cost, or just work, you know, have a more, now they had a smaller budget, maybe they actually had the means to actually get an entire toy line made all at once. It's a blurry mess how this came about. A lot of stuff in Transformers around Prime's time had a lot of weird decisions to it. But it made me feel bad because it led to some really inferior figures, like Knockout here. Like, what a shame. Because he's such a cool character with such a bad toy. And it's only bad because the designers at Hasbro had so little to work with at the time. Now, don't get me wrong. Some things did come of this. You know, necessity breeds ingenuity, as they say. The Viacon, for instance, I think the Prime RID is way better than the first edition. It's transformation magic. Look at how much cleaner it is. Look at how much, you know, more like, it's like more show accurate, felt proportions. I mean, is it as solid? No. You know, if you want a big, thick, complicated Transformer, get yourself the first edition. But that deluxe, that RID deluxe, is just genius. It's a genius figure. And when they had more budget to work with, like the larger size classes, you could see where they were still producing really good stuff. You know, this is around the era where, you know, Thrilling 30 Springer came out, and that's a phenomenal figure. Everyone loved that toy when it first dropped. You know, and there's multiple figures in that run that were really, really good and didn't really seem to be hampered. But when they had to go to smaller price points and smaller figures, that's where it seemed like they struggled the hardest. Now, this would continue into Age of Extinction, but by then, they seem to have gotten a handle on how to work the budget. There are ways to do it, finding ways of hollowing parts, reducing the part count, which reduces the assembly price. You know, because manufacturing cost does include the manual labor. That's one of the most expensive parts of the whole thing. So if you can get a whole toy out in fewer components, that helps a lot. If you can reduce how many molds they use, because the steel molds are ridiculously expensive, that helps a lot. And it feels like they started finding ways of doing that when it came to Age of Extinction. Yeah, the toys still weren't as big or robust as they used to be, but we felt like we were recovering. At the same time, though, Age of Extinction is where we started getting into this idea of separate toys for collectors and little kids. That's the first line where we had just a plethora of little gimmicky toys for kids to buy, and I can't help but wonder if the budget crunch of 2012 kind of made that happen, because those are far easier toys to produce. You know, they take much less material, they take way less assembly, so way less factory cost. And I feel like that's kind of what spurred on the decision to make that split happen. It's only a guess by my part, don't get me wrong, but it feels like it was definitely a creation of the time and a creation of the requirements that they had budget-wise. It would only be until about 2015 or so, when Combiner Wars came around, that I kind of feel like Transformers were back to feeling solid and larger again. You know, they kind of felt like they were the right size again. That said, a lot of shortcuts were taken in order to get the toys back to being the right size. You could see a lot more simplified engineering. You could see a lot more hollowed out parts. That doesn't mean the toys were bad, though. You know, the Combiner War toys, considering everything the Combiner War toys had to do, you know, not only does it have to be a fully featured figure with good articulation and accessories in all, you know, in its robot mode, have a really clean, playable vehicle mode, but it also has to become a leg, and the leg has to be the same size as every other leg so the combiners all stand balanced. And they all have to turn into an arm, and the arms all have to have the elbow in the same spot so the combiner stays balanced and looks correct. That's a lot to ask. So that's a lot of engineering that went into that entire line. That's where I kind of see that, yeah, it definitely is clear that the budgets and like the oil economy at the time recovered enough to actually produce really good toys again. And, you know, that's where we got the Prime War trilogy, which I thought was good. We are still feeling the effects. You know, those gimmicky toys were there to stay. It's been a long time since a show, or in this case, a brand new movie, was treated the way that the 2007 Transformer movie was, where you had a really high quality, robust toy line available as soon as that movie dropped. Now the only things available once a show or movie is out are these very simple, spring-loaded, gimmicky figures, low articulation. They spin, they flip, they, you know, like, you know, spin, what they do, you get it, you get my point. But it does mean that, you know, overall, the brand is still kind of hurting from what, you know, from the fallout of 2012 and what Hasbro learned in that time. Now, obviously, it does still sell because they still make these, but it doesn't make the brand look good when most of your stuff on the shelf looks really cheap and looks like you would get bored of it very quickly. I also can't help but think about all the long-term damage it did, because there's so many toys in that era that are very unlikely to get figures again, but that just happened to be when they came out. Some of them do have a chance of revival. I would expect if the Gamer Edition Studio Series continues, we'll get that Fall of Cybertron jazz. And it has to be better than the first one. The first one is not all that great. It's okay, but it's definitely not a great toy. I think back to that Bruticus a lot. That Fall of Cybertron Bruticus is such a cool design in-game, and we don't have one that's fully accurate. We definitely don't have one that feels good as a toy. This is one of those long shots. You know, if the budget crunch hadn't happened, I fully believe this set would have been absolutely fantastic, and we'd still be talking about it to this day, but it's just kind of a running gag right now. And I think back to characters from Prime. You know, now Generations has been touching on Prime a lot, but we know those figures have not always lived up to what we expected. You know, Knockout does not look like he should. Breakdown definitely doesn't look like he should. But there's characters like Arachnid who had truly awful toys in Transformers Prime, and they absolutely deserve another go-around, and I don't know if they ever will because they're not major enough for it. Maybe her inclusion in one might spur on some nostalgia and make a new toy possible, but it's highly unlikely. I also feel bad for the IDW designs because that's when Hasbro was willing to actually venture into the comic book designs for things. Trail Cutter only has one toy, and while I do like this toy, it doesn't feel big enough, it doesn't feel substantial enough. I kept feeling like I wish it had a little bit more to it, or it was treated, you know, more like the modern toys were. You know, I'd love to have that design and just a little bit bigger, a little bit beefier than just like a smallish deluxe allowed back then. And I think back to things like the IDW Megatron design that everyone really liked, and I really liked. It made my top 10 of that decade. But man, it's a Megatron. It shouldn't be a deluxe. This should have been a Voyager class. It should have been a lot more solid than it was. Like, that should be a huge stealth bomber. So, again, maybe this stuff finds some way of coming back again, but it feels like its time has come and gone. And because it was in that period where things just had to suffer because, the market sucks, capitalism sucks, it feels like we missed out on a lot. We missed out on what should have been a really, really good run of toys that unfortunately just suffered, especially if you were an IDW or a Fall of Cybertron fan. So, fingers crossed that Generations touches on these at some point, and fingers crossed that this does not happen again. If Hasbro really is looking at reducing the cost of how much what a toy costs at retail, I don't think they're going to take it out of their profits to make that happen. And I don't think they're going to overhaul everything they do just to get the cost of production down far enough for them to go, okay, a deluxe can be $19.99 again. I don't think that's happening. I feel like we're in for another bad budget crunch. Hopefully I am wrong though, but we'll have to wait and see. So that's your history lesson for the day. We will hope history does not repeat itself, but we'll keep an eye on it. And until then, thank you everyone for watching. I will see you next time.